Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm speaking with Sabine Mohamed, who is a political, urban, and economic anthropologist. She received her doctorate in anthropology from the University of Heidelberg in Germany in 2021. Her dissertation and current book project, which entitled Losing Ground, Emergent Black Empire and Counter Futures in Urban Ethiopia, is based on her field work in Addis Ababa and discusses how categories of Blackness and race, as well as the experiences of urban and national dispossession, are attached to an infrastructure of the Emergent Empire in Eastern Africa. Sabine was a Bridge to Faculty postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And prior to that, a doctoral research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany. I'm pleased to have Sabine on the channel. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
First, I'd like to discuss anthropology research in the context of Ethiopia. Although it's a diverse country, it seems that ethnicity is the main contributing factor of many conflicts that occur in the country, most recently the war in Tigray, as well as the splits within the Orthodox Church. How does one study the issue in a society as diverse as Ethiopia, and what tools can we use to understand this phenomenon?
Yeah, that's really an excellent question because I mean, so many scholars have been almost fascinated by this idea of an ethnic federal state that Ethiopia introduced in the 90s, which is, a very interesting time when you think about the fall of the Soviet Union, the kind of ideology that prevailed after the fall of the Soviet Union was the idea of liberalism, the idea of democracy that's not tied to forms of ethnicity. And it was really at that time where Ethiopia kind of toppled the Derg regime, which was a Marxist-Leninist military dictatorship, and had to kind of think about what like their imagination of a future is of Ethiopia, which was this large country with all these different ethnic groups that had mobilized actually at that time, right? You see the Oromo Liberation Front, you have the Amhara movement, you have the Tigray, the movement in Tigray, the most famous one, probably for listeners that don't know much about Ethiopia, the TPLF movement that has been more recently in the news. So, at that time, you have like loads of what you would call ethno-nationalist movements in Ethiopia that were kind of seeking the right of self-determination. They were trying to break away from Ethiopia, which they thought was really kind of limiting or erasing their own ethnicity and background, which started with the regime under the empire, with the Orthodox Christian empire under Haile Selassie, but then also was kind of prolonged during the Derg. And so when the Derg was kind of toppled in the 90s, one guerrilla movement, which was the TPLF party, kind of came onto the table and said, had this proposition of an ethnic federal state. Now, there are many ideas around why it is that they proposed this, right? Some people said it was for just like a crude politics of a divide and rule. Other people say it was maybe an idea of survival because the TPLF party, which was hailed from Tigray, which was one of the smallest actually ethnic populations within Ethiopia, was basically kind of trying to secure their way out by saying that each region had their own rights and could function in their own kind of federal state and could even break away from the state. So basically, I kind of came to your question from the other way in, basically kind of narrating to you the historical constellations that are really important to understand why we have a political structure that was called like an ethnic federal state up until 2019. And that basically meant that the whole country was remapped along ethnic linguistic lines. Now, that didn't always work wherever you looked, right? Like it worked for Tigray, the northern provinces, it worked for Amhara, it worked for Oromo regions, it works for Binish, Jangur, it that didn't work for the southern nations. It worked for Somali. But so you could see that this idea of an ethnic federal state officially had this logic of liberation and the right of self-determination. Now, what it actually did on the ground was that it kind of split the country more along these lines. Now, if you're a teacher, for example, right, and you grew up in the Amhara region, but you don't find a job there, and you want to go to the Oromo region, it's very hard for you if you don't know the language Afan Oromo. So it kind of almost siloed loads of ethnicities within their own compound. And then there was this whole talk about corruption of the local elites, which kind of abused or used the structure of ethnic federalism to their own ends. Now, when I kind of started to think about doing my research in Ethiopia, I was really interested in like the attempts of the government of like really urbanizing Ethiopia, right? And the most pertinent space was Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, which has historically always been the site of all these transformations, right? Ethiopia ran through loads of different ideologies, like from the empire, which was kind of thinking about Ethiopia more in feudal terms and Christian terms, to the regime under the Derg, which was thinking about Ethiopia as a space for a socialist, almost communist-like state, right? Up until like recently with Meles Zenawi and Haile Mariam Desalegn as an ethnic federal state. Now with Abiy, the current prime minister, there's a whole new ideology that we see unfolding. And interestingly enough, for Ethiopia, Addis Ababa was always this central node that was supposed to show all these forms of transformation. So I kind of was interested in studying how this idea of a new Addis Ababa, that means like all these urban transformations, these mega projects, kind of allows us to think about belonging in Addis and how these different ethnic groups kind of make sense of this, right? There were all these kind of programs around social housing for the poor or for the working class, which ended up only being kind of available for the middle classes. I mean, the middle class is a very Eurocentric term, but those that were kind of more well-to-do. And so my project was kind of looking at it from an angle of urban transformation, as well as Eritreans who were born and raised in Addis and were deported after Eritrea's independence and returned to Addis. And so I was kind of interested in like, how do they make sense of all these transformations and the push and pull factors within the city? And how do we think actually then about this idea of ethnic federalism on the ground and ethnographically?
And some of these phenomena have been codified. For instance, the ethnic federalist system in Ethiopia since 1991 has been incorporated in the Constitution in Article 39, where it stipulates that states are allowed or regions are allowed to secede from Ethiopia. How has Ethiopia's national image been defined since that time? What historical trends or factors have decided this has been the case for the country?
Well, I think that's really interesting. I mean, if you think about it, it basically has at its kernel the idea of annihilation, right? If you thought about, like, if you think it true, if every federal state has the right to secede from the state, what is left of Ethiopia, right? Now, technically, it's not so easy to split from the country because you have to have a two-third majority, and so it has to go through all like these kind of bureaucratic layers, and so it's not easy for any actually federal state to split away from Ethiopia. But what it did, and I think this is something that we see right now, that the idea of Ethiopia as a country, as a unifying force, as a collective, has somehow become more fragmented, right? And it's very hard. Like, so what I saw in my interviews is actually that a lot of my interlocutors really struggled to narrate the same history. Yeah, like if you say, yeah, you know, that they it was Menelik who kind of fought off the Italians in the Battle of Adwa, the most famous battle of Ethiopia, kind of averting European colonialism. You find loads of people that would actually say, you know, on the other hand, Menelik also then used this force that they had in the north to kind of defeat the Italian invading forces to actually colonize or at least occupy large chunks of Oromo land. So what I'm saying is actually that I think with this Article 39, with the shift of thinking of Ethiopia more as a way of a state where one can belong and where one can retreat from, there's also been a shift in this idea that Ethiopia can remain forever, which is like this dream of an empire, right? The Orthodox Christian empire that narrated itself as this long dynastic line of 3,000 years from Solomon up until now. And now you see that people actually, the Kero movement, which is a movement mainly consisting of young activists or Oromo activists, often students, that kind of started to say, you know, this kind of power agenda that we always have been excluded from the politics has to end, actually. There has to be a shift in the way politics and forms of representation work in Ethiopia. So I think I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but I do think that this possibility of being able to split away has provided almost a platform to imagine oneself outside of it, right? And I don't know if that was the idea, but for sure, I think, you know, with all the critique of the TPLF party, and there's lots to say about, you know, the times up until Abiy came into power. It enabled, for sure, in all these regions, a new language to become present and visible, right? Beforehand, it was always assumed that Amharic is a language that unifies all, when in fact, Amharic has been a language that had excluded large populations, especially when you think about the regions south of the Addis and even Tigray, right? So there has been an Amharian dominance historically, and I think that has shifted with the article, with the idea of self-determination within this kind of assembly of all these nationalities. One of my interlocutors, who is from Gondar, and most of them were also from the Amhara region, or some of them at least, said that now is the first time that they actually have to identify themselves as Amhara, right? And so what that says is that beforehand, the idea of Ethiopia was almost equalized with the idea of being Amhara. And so I think it shows how difficult the politics of identity and representation are, but it also kind of allowed people to think about what it is when they talk about Ethiopia, what it actually means, or whose history it kind of entails. And you can see, I think, with Abi's idea of Medamar, that's another iteration of thinking about what to do with the plurality that is present in Ethiopia or within the confines of what is Ethiopia.
Yeah, it seems like the attitude of many Ethiopians is that there should be a shift towards an egalitarian system of understanding everyone's place in society. And with regard to Medemir, this notion of synergy or unity among different peoples. But it hasn't always been easy. You spoke about how the Amharic language has been used to try to centralize the Ethiopian identity. How does that shape society in such a way where people start to question whether or not their membership of a state is valid? Probably the most prominent example of this is within the Tigray region, where they have been pretty really emphasizing their place within the country by establishing their own political organizations and trying to run their region the way they see fit. But in a more general understanding about this phenomenon, whether it be in the Somali region, in Oromia, in Benishangul Gumuz, how do different peoples throughout the country see themselves when they refer to the state and how they refer to each other?
So I have to kind of maybe say that my work has mostly been in and around Addis. And I did also started research in Tigray. So obviously I follow the news, but I just kind of want to flag that as well, that it's kind of hard for me to talk about Western Ethiopia as well as the southern part. But I think one of the effects you can see, especially I think within Tigray, it's very complicated because on one hand, Tigray has kind of become now a space of despair and war, and like the conversations about how to talk about these mass killings that happened, right? Do we frame them as genocide? And how do we kind of continue from there? At the same time, you see that the peace treaty has been signed and sealed, but what does that mean for the people in Tigray? I do think that I think it was a double-edged sword, the idea of ethnic federalism, which always, I mean, that was for me something that was very striking. You saw like a global trend where people kind of veered away from thinking about citizenship that is mediated through ethnic affiliation. And that's basically what you're talking about, right? It is. So what happens if some ethnicity is not clear? Like what happens then to the modality of citizenship? We often understand citizenship as this kind of, I mean, there's so many ways of thinking about citizenship, and there's a whole literature, a vast literature that kind of tackles the issue around citizenship and forms of affiliation and membership. But I think within Ethiopia, it was always very difficult, even the way it kind of formalized forms of ethnicities and belonging. Now you can make that even if you don't want to think further, but let's say you are born to parents that both have different ethnic affiliations, right? And you are almost forced. Now it's most of the times it's a patrilineal affiliation, right? It goes after the father, but the fact that you always had to choose your identity according to an ethnicity is very difficult. And you saw that in others, in urban centers, where people actually don't think that way. But the space was so carted off that not only did you have to have your affiliation, but the way you could vote was also only you could only vote ethnic parties. So your own like sense of like thinking about rights and duties and obligation and forms of economies were always tied to an assumption of ethnicity. And that ethnicity was actually, interestingly enough, always defined through linguistic um, um, towards an ethno-linguistic marker. So I think especially now when we see the war uh, in Tigray that has just formally been called quits, right? But we don't know about Eritrean forces there, but that it's very hard for these people to kind of come back, like even like to think about Ethiopia as their home in terms of ethnicity, in terms of belonging, because these labels have become basically a front to kind of fight all kinds of problems of basically economic distribution, right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And as you mentioned, we've seen in the past 2 years the terrible war in Tigray, in the northern Ethiopian region of Tigray, where thousands have died, millions have been displaced, and a population now within Ethiopia seriously considering leaving the federation, at one point actually calling for secession in order to determine their own fate. Uh, how has the conflict influenced the way that populations in Ethiopia associate with their country? You spoke about how people inside Addis Ababa seem to be kind of shielded off from the rest of the country in terms of the way of how they perceive their own nationality or citizenship or association with the state. How has the example of the war in Tigray affected this relationship that people have between the state and their ethnicity, or the state and their ethno-linguistic group? And are there other examples in Africa where wars and conflict affect how people perceive their membership within society?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many cases, and um, I think the most dramatic case probably is Rwanda in some ways, right? And that has really enshrined an idea of the two dominant ethnic groups, which are Hutu and the Tutsi, and in a way that it really kind of has become the political infrastructure of the country, right? In terms of who gets demonized and who becomes who gets actually to represent Rwanda, and who has to kind of carry the burden of these atrocities and crimes that have been committed in the name of a particular ethnic group, which was in 1994 the Hutu ethnic group, or the majority of Hutus soldiers and those that kind of were groomed to become these killers in that genocide. Now, I think there are cases where people say that this form of reconciliation that has been attempted has not fully worked in a way that the Hutu have become a part of the society without this baggage of that history. I think other cases, you could look to South Africa, right? How South Africa had to deal with and had to come to terms with the legacies of apartheid that still structure in very real terms the political economy of the country and forms of representation. Now, what we see in South Africa is actually really interesting and maybe also inspiring, that they really think about, okay, so how can we actually decolonize this space? And how can we actually think about a future that's not reinforcing these structures of segregations within our society. That's really difficult. But it's happening, and it's kind of inspiring, you know, movements here in the US, right? When they think about we had Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, and that kind of traveled to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, but it also kind of ended up in Harvard. It kind of inspired scholarly debates around the significance of statues and forms of memory and history, and like how do we memorize and memorialize and kind of pay tribute to a past that is so contingent on these kind of violent erasures and aspects and episodes of mass violence, actually, and incarceration. In Ethiopia, I think it kind of plays out in a different way, and it's really interesting to think about it more, or to ask oneself how and why we see all these ethno-nationalist movements being such a strong force, right? To mobilize, but that they do, like they collaborate. You had a moment where the Oromo movement, some Oromo movements and some Tigray movements in Tigray, splinter groups of TPLF kind of collaborated and thought about how to thought about in really real terms of kind of going against the federal government, right? And thinking about forms of representation, but that was mostly to the military wing. But that time, especially I think under Haile Selassie, where you had these student movements within the university that kind of rallied around an ideology, an idea, of liberation, of self-determination, of equality, an egalitarian society, and toppling the monarchy. They have actually become less and less in some ways, right? And I think it had something to do, at least with the Derg coming into power. And the Derg came into the power in 1974, and they toppled the monarchy. But what they also did, they had a really fist, like an iron fist in some ways, and all forms of dissent was kind of executed in some ways. There's so many mass graves outside of Addis Ababa. And what this meant for all the students that were mobilizing on campus and all these other different nodes in Addis is that they kind of fled, they kind of dispersed. And that was also part of the agenda of the Derg, which they kind of sent the intellectuals into the villages to educate. But it also meant that the city, the urban space that was always seen as this dangerous site of resistance and rebellion was kind of emptied out. So you see like a lot of the students from Tigray went back to Tigray. You see a lot of like the Oromo students went to Oromo. And so they mobilized basically in their own backyard, right? And one could say, because in Tigray in particular, it was organized really as more as a peasant society, and it kind of was more homogeneous in some ways, that it actually had much more coherence as a force, right? So there are many, many factors to think about the rippling effects of this kind of idea to attach ethnicity to citizenship. But I would say that in most cases, it kind of becomes very problematic very fast, because it always gets mobilized as this way to think about other contesting items, be it the economy, be it forms of redistribution, forms of representation politically. And you could see even in Ethiopia that lay people would often confuse Tigray with the TPLF party, right?
That's a very interesting comparative analysis of how uh, the experience of different peoples within Ethiopia has shaped the perception of statehood over decades from the empire to the contemporary era. And just to follow up on this point, it's obvious that the toll of wars have had these drastic events on populations, but how do other forms of repression, such as economic disparity, cause changes in how a society perceives itself within a larger union such as Ethiopia?
I honestly think that I don't want to say it's economy, right? Like I don't want to like just pin it down onto one aspect. I think there are multiple aspects that come together. But I do think that uh I do think one decisive factor of the current problems within Ethiopia are attributed to forms of the economy, the forms of um, the political economy, how it has kind of allowed a particular group of people to profit, um, and other and a particular group has often been kind of sidelined or marginalized. So my work actually on basically people working in the informal sector and others was really interesting, right? Because it kind of, most of the people had a mixed background. So they, you know, I think they would say sometimes, oh yeah, I'm from this and that group, and whatever kind of seems maybe more powerful. But if you would sit down or like go to their homes, you'd see that it's a much more complex situation. But those people were almost left out of all these conversations of reimagining Ethiopia, rethinking others as this new cosmopolitan space, right? There was a time where others was this driving force, not only in Africa, but like seen in the global south with like the highest GDP and growth development and all these projects. China was really committed to investing in large in investing in Ethiopia and to think about Ethiopia as this node that connects China through the maritime route, basically into Ethiopia, and you see all the roads that were built. But if you want to kind of simplify, the urban poor, so to say, had really nothing to say about all these forms of transformation. And so I was working with a group of people whose houses were demolished, and they were kind of told to kind of move to these condominium houses, which were often on the edge of the city. And they were really beautiful and nice, but most of these economies for these people were informal, right? Like somebody sells charcoal, or they make their own beer, and they have these houses that they don't have to pay for. Now, in these condominium complexes, the rent is really high. There's no informal economy. There are no schools. So it's really expensive even to get from there to the city. You have to take this bajaj, and then you have to take a bus. So you're really kind of disconnected. And then those people that would maybe win in the lottery, which Ethiopia proposed that there's a lottery and some people can, if they win it, they get a condominium house. They basically just have the walls but no community, right? And these people have really lived within communities. They have associations. If somebody dies, there will be a funeral arrangement. If something else, so everything is kind of already sorted out. And I'm not saying that these people were not ready for these forms of modernity, but I think what I'm saying is that there was no conversation if those people were actually willing to move and what they would need in order to do so. So in some ways, it kind of became much more political much more political and addressed also forms of economy, right? And the people that are in the driving seat and can actually afford it. So you see that the ones that had like maybe more secure jobs that didn't work in the informal economies, and maybe worked in forms of like had administrative positions or worked more in political offices. For them, this kind of proposition was much more easier to live with, but they were all struggling, right?
So I'd like to discuss Eritrea and the recent political and social history of the country since its independence in 1991. Similar to Ethiopia, multiple ethnic groups live in the country, and it seems more socially cohesive among levels of various social classes, such as religion, ethnicity, and language. But this is at the cost of the terrible repression that the regime has instilled due to the militarization of the country. Based on the history of Eritrea since its independence, how would you compare the challenges faced by Eritreans in terms of intra-population engagement versus Ethiopia? To what extent are these two countries' governments responsible for contributing to the population's social issues, and how can we understand them in the context of anthropology?
Yeah, these are questions that often keep me up awake at night. Um, I think I should add here that actually, in a roundabout way, I ended up writing about Eritrea in my master thesis. And I ended with the question of thinking, okay, so in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in a way of nation building and reconciliation of the 30-year-long struggle for independence, we have a new ideology of Hade Hizbi, Hade Libi. One people, one heart. And I was like struck by it, right? Because it didn't allow for difference. It didn't allow for people to have already, right? Like there was one body, and that body became later on Isaias, right? When he kind of consolidated his power, he became Nahna Nusu Nusu Nahna. Like he became all of that, and almost like in Hobbes, there's this idea, political theorist back from the 16th century who thinks about the Leviathan, which is like this monster that is this sovereign power which is necessary to keep people together, right? Because if there is no sovereign like that, like this kind of beast, people would kind of revert back to nature, the condition of nature, which is obviously nature in this reading was something very negative. So yeah, in Eritrea we had that. On the other hand, almost on the contrary, Ethiopia at the same time says, no, unity lies actually in diversity, right? And so these ideas could not be farther away from each other, at least formally. And for me, it was interesting. Then obviously I had to go to Ethiopia and to understand what was happening there and how they actually managed with a population that's like over 100 million now, right? To convey this idea of unity when there are so many languages, so many traditions, so many different settings. And how Ethiopia can still stay alive in the everyday. So your question was about Eritrea, and I think we'll just return to Eritrea now for the purposes of it. I think it's quite interesting that Eritrea, at least from the outside, did not have these schisms, be it on the side of religion, ethnic forms of belonging, though they are right? It's kind of, when we think about Kunama and Afar and the forms of how they relate to Eritrea, and Rashaida, it's very, very different. Um, but we can say that there is a cohesiveness that is more visible than it is currently apparent in Ethiopia. And so I think one of the things that SAS did, and really successfully, was to kind of completely militarize the country. So everyone had to go to Sawa. And I mean, we don't think about it in that way, but from a side of like nation building and sense of belonging and identity, I mean, every youth had to go to Sawa. Even the school, the last year of school, was kind of based in that kind of military zone in Gashbarka. So, in some ways, I think it allowed at least a sort of cohesiveness. Now, the question is that cohesiveness one that allows for different voices to kind of emerge? And I think that's not the case, right? I mean, there's literature around how in Eritrea, there's a form of Tigrinization, right? Tigrinya becomes that lingua franca. Everyone has to speak in Tigrinya in order to converse. There's an idea, an underbelt of like Orthodox Christianity that kind of becomes more representative in some ways. And there were kind of incidents, I think, when people were kind of trying to vote away, that they are more suspicious of Muslim communities, and was what was the I'm blanking now on the name. Musa, was it
Haj Musa.
Haj Musa, yeah, when he kind of started almost a rebellion in some ways, right? That became successful, but that really surprised people that so many different people rallied around him, and actually eventually also the Catholic Church kind of stepped in and asked for a non-interventionist agenda of the president, who kind of shut down the Catholic schools, but also Muslim institutions, Islamic institutions. So I think that cohesiveness is also part of a really dangerous pressure cooker that is that dictatorship in Eritrea in some ways, right? That different opinions are not really surfacing. Now, one cannot blame everything onto one person, right? I'm always interested in like, how does then diversity play out outside of the country, right? Like within an Eritrean diaspora, which is really strong, and has really impacted, and one could even argue, help the Eritrean nation to become independent, right? To all these politics of support, financial, military wise, politically, that even the people that are being represented are often from a particular group, right? We don't hear much from Eritreans that live in Saudi Arabia. We don't hear that much from Eritreans that live in Australia. And so I think that became much more visible when Haj Musa, when that kind of protest started, that people in Australia were saying, we are joining this movement, which is called Yaakov. So I think, I think there are things that we have to pay attention in terms of how representation works. I do think that Ethiopia's case should make us wary of an institutionalized form. I think one has to recognize forms of minority rights. But yeah, I think the solutions is not necessarily in dividing up the country along ethnic and religious lines, especially if they have not been defined, the lines that have been the ones that became salient in terms of conflict.
And it seems
Now,
that,
the
yeah,
yeah,
I
go
wanted
ahead.
to point out something that you mentioned, which I think is very poignant, is that at the cost of political equality, it seems that the regime in Eritrea has tried to unify the nation through
Mhm,
mechanisms, as you said, of ethnic, linguistic uh, equality, sort of
mhm.
trying to have a harmony among the nation, irrespective of where people come from, that we are all Eritrean in this new defined sense. But it's come at the cost of uh, probably one of the worst crackdowns of political dissent that Africa has seen. And Isaiah Afwerki, as much as people would credit him in this regard, he's really repressed the society to such the extent that there is no room for political diversity in the country to blossom. And it seems like this is a unique factor in Eritrea, which is unlike Ethiopia, has not allowed the population to really express itself. There's never been elections in Eritrea. There've never been a parliamentary meeting over legislature that people have actually seen. There's no budget that's published. How do we think of different forms of inequalities between Eritrea and Ethiopia? And what does it say about the attitudes of the leadership of these countries and what they perceive to be the biggest issues that they face as they govern the societies?
I think which I think it's so telling. I mean, there's so much criticism in terms of Abi's conduct, right? And we could talk actually much more about that. And I think there's valid concern and has been concerned from the very beginning, even in terms of his election or non-election into power, and the way he kind of purged um, a lot of the political elites that were in power when he came, and none of them are there. So there's loads we could discuss around that, but I think it's really important to also stay with your point, which I think is super important to acknowledge in terms of speaking about Eritrea's condition, which is almost unique in some ways, right? You mentioned that there has been not an election, there has not been a bill codified, there's no constitution, and the president basically governs through a decree, or basically as he wants. And I think that has caused severe problems. For example, if you think about it, I thought that was really interesting. When Abiy came in 2018, when the peace treaty, during the time of the peace agreement, when he came to Asmara, like there were loads of women on the streets and they were all yelling and screaming out of joy, or I don't know, maybe they were ordered to do so, but no one called Isaiah's name. Everyone said Abi. So their hope did not go to their own president, but really to this foreigner who basically came, and no one knew what the peace treaty entailed. There was no discussion. The formal political party has not been in session for many years now. I think at least since 2004. That's also in 2004, one could say, were they really in formal session, but at least did they decide anything? But there's no political party. Nobody knows how the incremental workings work day to day. But this really is, as you say, poses a really severe problem in terms of political governance and about a society that actually had never had a say in all the decisions that have been made, right? And that's and so the school, the university has been shut down in 2006. So education is not a space where people can deliberate. We know from reports of refugees that actually went to Minor Feed, a college that was built instead in the desert, so to say, that there is no space for thinking as well there because people are exhausted. It's in the heat. I mean, there's so many conditions that kind of prohibit forms of engagement. And so the political organization has been severely shaped by the structure that ECS has introduced in the 90s and the formal grip. So people actually that cannot live with that situation actually have to leave the country. Right. So we almost have no youth present in Eritrea because the military, the forms of conscriptions have no beginning, no end in some ways. So people end up in that conscription service as for an amount of time that they cannot even foresee. And they do all kinds of work. They can be gardeners, they can build houses, they can build streets, they can be in one isolated post. So it's very, very hard to think about a social cohesiveness outside of the space of not being allowed to say and to integrate the ideas of difference into that space. People actually have no trust because they feel that SCS has instituted a system of spies that even infiltrate the family, the family structure, the texture of the family. And so I think I'm not really answering your question, but it's because it's so layered and it kind of I mean, that's where an anthropological work would be really important, right? To actually be in Eritrea and to study and to understand the force of these conditions in every aspect of people's lives.
Yeah,
And
and
I
what
think
I'm sorry, go ahead.
and I think with the peace treaty between Eritrea and Ethiopia, there was a real hope for people in the diaspora as well as in the country that maybe reforms will start to come, and that has not been the case. Quite to the contrary, ICS has actually mobilized even more young people to fight a war that nobody really knows anything about in Eritrea, that has never been discussed as such.
I,
Um,
I would add that the inability to understand the situation in the country just reflects the policy of the regime in its stance to try to unify the population in terms of um, letting everyone know this is the plan that we intend to pursue. And we've seen this throughout the conflict in Tigray, where thousands of Eritrean youth were mobilized in the conflict, perhaps against their will, to fight in a war which, as you said, had no clear motivations. The intent was not really defined. The Eritrean government never has fully admitted its presence in Tigray or has actually commented directly on their interference in Ethiopia's internal affairs. And one of the main phenomena which has defined the Eritrean experience since independence is the refugee crisis, which has been a result of militarization and the subsequent risk of depopulation to the country, as you said, that there's no youth. It's affected the relationship that the diaspora has had with the Eritrean government, as well as with the international community. Um, and in speaking about these points when discussing the differences between Eritrea and Ethiopia, there seems to be a certain sense of freedom in Ethiopia when it comes to political spaces that doesn't exist in Eritrea. And it seems that the government in Eritrea blames these so-called pull factors for depopulation and conspiratorial networks such as the United States and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, rather than the internal state violence. I'm not saying that it's only one or the other. It's definitely a more complex intersection of these different factors that have come together. But from your perspective, as someone who studies the political motivations of societies, how has the case of Eritrea demonstrated this overall trend of state violence as a consequence of trying to unify the population? How can we examine this aspect of the country since its independence?
Yeah, I mean, usually, I mean, every nation state has at its core uh, um, a tremendous amount of violence, um, which it has to translate in meaning, right? So that these mass killings and that these people that give their lives in a war make sense. And we often call this or frame this as form of sacrifice. The minute you talk about sacrifice, it kind of allows you to think about the nation. But at one point, you have to forget about this, right? So in order to feel American, you can't always think about the genocide that has been done onto like the attempt of genocide to native populations present, right? Like you think about American because you're born here and you have the rights and you feel in a certain way. Um, and so I think in Eritrea that has become really difficult, right? Because what we see is actually that there's always a reproduction of these forms of violence and even asking for more sacrifice. Yeah, I think Isaias in many ways has assumed almost a power that will always make someone like him paranoid, right? Because he became much more than the state. It's very easy to become a president and then to have your term and to leave. But him, uh, Isaias, he tried to become the revolution, the Eritrean independence. He became the Eritrean post-independence state, the liberation. How does liberation look? And so, in some ways, he always had to eliminate everyone that has an opposing idea, which is like multiple. Now, I don't know if you have seen this, but he was just recently in Kenya at a press conference, and then he was asked by a journalist about those Eritrean soldiers that were killed in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, and A, if he acknowledges that, and B, how many were killed. And he was totally flustered. And it is because in Eritrea, there is no dissent. There are no newspapers. There's no forum of deliberation. All the ministers that actually want to say something, even ask for reform, disappear, are not there, are imprisoned. And so I think what we will see is actually that this form of repression and oppression will only continue. And there's no end to it unless, so the point is we're almost racing to an event where things have to be resolved in some ways. If people decide not to leave anymore, or to say, why are we leaving, or why do we live in these refugee camps just like 3 hours away from Eritrea under these really concerning conditions, what if we just return? I think the questions will become different, and I think that's a problem, right? And that's why we have so much violence, because you have to repress so much, but because you repress so much, it might come up in some ways. And that's what happened in Ethiopia. If you think about it, in 2015, just to come back to that point, we had the elections in Ethiopia, and I think the previous elections in 2010, I think the result was something around 96% for the EPRDF party at that time, which was basically another emblem for saying that the TPLF won. So then in 2015, people were saying, so what is it going to be now? Because if you go down from 96, then that, even though everyone knew it was manufactured, then that looks bad for the government. So they actually have to go up. And they managed, right? So the results came in, and 99.6% voted for the EPRDF party. Now that meant that now suddenly all forms of opposition, which are natural in all societies, disappeared, right? Now they're underground, and now nobody can tell what is actually happening in the country because you don't let them even speak. And then obviously what you could see in 2016, first protests were there and people were saying, so I don't know, like there's no representation. All these plans of like renewal and redoing others on the cost of Oromo farmland, that's not really working for the farmers. And so you saw that people are actually mobilizing and contesting and looking for these spaces to actually um, to make transparent what their thoughts and ideas are. And if you can't do it in a parliament, you have to do it in other venues in some ways, on the streets or to other forms of protest and mobilization. And so in Eritrea, I think that's one thing that I think allows us to see why ICS is letting all these people, young people, leave the country, even though there's an order to shoot policy at the border and nobody gets shot. Like some people are in prison, but basically the borders are open because he knows if they want to leave, if they're not happy and they want to leave, it's better to let them leave than to have them stay in the country.
Yeah, it seems to me that um, the more that you push the barrier of how much your power can be exuded in the country, the more risk you put on yourself. As a
Yeah.
consequence, it could actually backfire. And unfortunately, we don't really have the insight to understand the full social dynamics of Eritrea because it's a closed off society. But in closing, I'd like to ask, uh, pertaining to the immediate future of Eritrea and Ethiopia, how can we perceive relations between the two countries moving forward since the Tigray conflict with the internal issues in both countries? How will this era of history be defined when we look back and try to understand the situation from both sides? And also, how can the diaspora be engaged in trying to understand the political dynamics of both countries?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question. That's also something that I'm thinking about in my own research. And I think from the Ethiopian side, as well as from the Eritrean side, we can say that there is ambiguity on how to resolve the border. Now that sounds very like a simple, like a simple observation, but what I mean is more that we had the border war, and there was a decision about demarcation of these contested um, um, sites that should be demarked, and it is actually all already on paper. And at different times, different parties, especially under Zenawi, Ethiopia has not fully abided to the rulings of the commission, the border commission, in order to resolve the conflict. But for sure, I think there were windows and openings to do so, especially in 2018. And it hasn't been done, right? And so I think for me, that says something very interesting about people not aiming to resolve that issue that for all intents and purposes maybe never was a big issue, right? Because that land really is not the most um, uh, fertile land anyway. There's no oil hidden there, there's no gold, there are no diamonds, at least not that we know of, not that we are aware of. Maybe there is, and then everything makes sense. But let's assume there's nothing hidden in hindsight underneath the ground in the soil. But then what else does this tell us, right? For Ethiopia, it was always important to have access to the Red Sea in order to imagine itself much more stronger, to not be dependent on Djibouti and the high taxes and all the deals that they had to make with the government in Djibouti. But really kind of, I mean, there's a road that is much faster and really straight to Assab. And interestingly, that road is much more accessible from the Ethiopian side. From Eritrea, it's really almost inaccessible. People usually actually take a ship from Assab to Massawa, and from Massawa, they go to Asmara. So on the Ethiopian side, there's something attractive to imagine itself within Eritrea or through Eritrea along the Red Sea, which explain all the euphoria within the population when actually the peace treaty was signed. And for Eritrea, I think we don't know. But for Isaias, I think there's also something that keeps him wanting to be part of Ethiopia in some ways, right? Because nothing has been resolved. So I think that's something that we have to think about in terms of the ideologies and ideas and ambitions that these two countries have that are not maybe necessarily the border, but what the border signifies in some ways. Does it signify a connection? Does it signify an imperial future? And I would say, at least for Ethiopia, yeah, it kind of allows them to think about that. Now, with the TPLF, with the political party just in between, which was a close ally of the EPLF party, and now is the arch enemy, I think another layer of complexity is added. And I think what would be probably the most generative for both countries would be actually an economic zone, right? Like an idea of like exchange that allows both countries to kind of have a shared political economy that does not come at the cost of some of the sovereignty of one nation state over the other.
Well, Sabine, I'd like to give you the final word.
The final word, yeah, I think I guess my final word would be, in order to think about conflicts, especially between Ethiopia and Eritrea, or within Ethiopia and within Eritrea, it's important to think about the role of history, but not as a history that is linear, but how people mobilize ideas about history. And that kind of allows us to see where they position themselves and what kind of futures people imagine. Because history is something that is all that can become really fast an aspect of political imaginary, right? Being excluded, wanting to be included, and that kind of form of exclusion kind of becomes then the blueprint for how we want to imagine forms of inclusivity.
Well, Sabine, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you for having me.